They didn't even make it past the threshold. My mother's suitcase tipped sideways onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, its wheels still spinning aimlessly, as if the house itself were rejecting her return. My father stood frozen behind her, one hand still gripping the handle of the front door. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. They were staring first at the living room, then at the hospital bed that now dominated the space. Their eyes tracked the oxygen machine, humming with a low, steady rhythm where my father's favorite leather recliner used to be. Finally, their gaze landed on my sister and then, inevitably, on me. My mother's voice was a fragile whisper, a sound that seemed entirely foreign to her. "No. No, this can't be happening." She took a tentative step forward, her eyes frantically scanning the four-stand, the medical charts clipped neatly to a plastic board, and the stack of white envelopes piled high on the coffee table. My father's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. "What did you do?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not yet. I knew none of it made sense to them, not the clinical silence, not the rigid order of the room, and certainly not the way the house no longer felt like it belonged to them. And that was exactly the point. A month earlier, the house had been quiet, in a different way. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, as if grief were already crouching in the corners, waiting for something worse to happen. My parents had stood in the kitchen, carefully avoiding eye contact with each other, with me, and with Lily. Lily sat at the table, huddled inside a thick blanket despite the late spring warmth. Her hands trembled slightly around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Finally, my mother spoke, her words sounding practiced and rehearsed. "I think we all need some space." My father nodded quickly, far too quickly. "This environment. It's not healthy. Not for any of us." I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed, still wearing my off-duty clothes. I had been home for less than a week. "Space," I repeated flatly. No one answered right away. Lily offered a small, exhausted smile, the kind she used when she was trying to make things easier for everyone else. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'll be fine." That was always Lily, forever the one trying to smooth over the jagged edges of our lives. My mother reached for her purse, her movements hurried. "We've already booked the trip," she said. "It's just for a little while. A reset." "Where?" I asked. "Europe," my father replied, as if he were providing a perfectly reasonable detail. "Italy, France. Just a few places." "For how long?" There was a sickening pause. "A month." The word sat in the air like something rotting. I looked at Lily. She was staring down at the table now, her knuckles white as her fingers tightened around the mug. "You're leaving," I said slowly. "For a month." My father's jaw tightened. "You just got back," he argued. "You can handle things here. You're capable." He didn't say it as a compliment. He said it as an excuse. "We'll check in," my mother added quickly, still avoiding my eyes. "Of course we will." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Her dialysis schedule just increased, I told them. 3 times a week, sometimes 4. "I know," my mother said, her voice sharp and defensive. "And the insurance situation is still a mess." "We left the documents for you," my father cut in. "Everything is organized." Everything was organized. Like it was a business trip. Like Lily was just a set of files to be handed over to a new manager. I studied my voice, keeping it low and even. "You're really doing this?" Neither of them answered me directly. My mother picked up her purse again, her eyes fixed on the door. "We need this," she whispered. That was the closest thing to honesty I was going to get. They needed it, so they were taking it, and they were leaving everything else behind. The morning they left, the house felt hollow. Suitcases rolled across the floor, zippers were tugged shut, and car doors slammed with finality. My father gave me a firm, brisk nod, like we were handing off a shift at a job site. "You've got this," he said. My mother hugged Lily, holding on a second longer than usual, but still not long enough. "We'll be back before you know it," she whispered. Lily smiled, because that was her role. "I'll be here," she said. They didn't look back as they drove away. I stood in the driveway until their taillights disappeared at the end of the street. Then I went back inside. That first night, Lily tried to act like things were normal. We watched an old movie we'd both seen a dozen times. She laughed at all the right parts, even though I could see the sheer exhaustion behind her eyes. "You don't have to sit with me all night," she said at one point. "I'm okay." I shook my head. "I've handled worse watches than this." That earned me a small smile. "You always say that." Because it's true. But it wasn't the same. In the military, you trained for the unknown, for the fight. Here, I was watching a battle I couldn't fight with a weapon. The routine began the next morning: dialysis appointments, medication schedules, and endless hours on the phone with insurance representatives who spoke in circles. I learned how to read her lab results, how to adjust her diet, and how to recognize the subtle, terrifying signs that something was wrong. I set alarms for every pill, every fluid check. I didn't miss a single one. At night, I sat at the kitchen table with stacks of paperwork spread out before me: bills, statements, and insurance denials. My parents texted occasionally, sending pictures of famous landmarks and smiling faces in front of ancient fountains. "Thinking of you both," my mother wrote once, followed by a heart emoji. I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone face down on the table. A week into their trip, Lily had a bad day. She could barely make it from the car to the front door, and I had to catch her before her knees hit the pavement. "I'm okay," she insisted, even as her body failed her. "You don't have to say that to me," I told her quietly. She leaned against me, her weight so much lighter than it should have been. "I just don't want to be a burden," she whispered. The word hit me harder than any physical blow. "You're not," I said, my voice firm. "You are not a burden." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That night, I didn't go to my room. I stayed awake in the chair beside her bed, listening to the steady, fragile rhythm of her breathing, counting each one as if it were a precious resource. Because it was. 2 weeks in, the doctor called me into his office. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Her condition is progressing faster than we hoped," he said. I kept my expression neutral. "What are options?" He folded his hands on his desk. "A transplant would give her the best chance. The only real chance. And if that doesn't happen?" He hesitated, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "Then we manage the symptoms. We keep her comfortable." Comfortable. I nodded once. "Run the compatibility tests." He looked at me carefully. "For you?" "Yes." The results came back 3 days later. I was a match. I sat in my truck in the hospital parking lot, the lab report trembling slightly in my hand. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, it felt like a line in the sand, a point of no return. I thought about calling my parents. I thought about giving them a chance to come home and be part of this. I even picked up the phone. Then I put it back down. I already knew what they would say. Asterisk, wait. Let's talk about this. Don't do anything drastic. Asterisk, they had already made their choice. Now, I was making mine. That night, I sat beside Lily's bed again. She was half asleep, her voice a soft murmur. "You're still here," she breathed. "Yeah," I said. She smiled faintly. "I knew you would be." I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat. Always. The next morning, I walked into the hospital and signed the consent forms. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just a pen, a signature, and a decision. Because some things in this life don't wait for permission. The consent forms were still warm from the printer when I stepped out of the hospital into the late afternoon light. The air smelled of cut grass and hot pavement. Across the parking lot, the world was moving in its ordinary, oblivious ways. A young couple argued quietly over a car seat. An older man patiently pushed his wife's wheelchair toward the entrance. For a brief, surreal moment, I felt like the world should have stopped. It didn't. I sat in my truck, closed the door, and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. I was a match. Not just a possibility, not just hope, wrapped in the vague language doctors used to keep families from collapsing. I was the solution. The transplant coordinator had been calm and professional. She walked me through the steps: more tests, clearances, surgical dates, risks, and the potential impact on my military career. It was all laid out plainly, stripped of drama. I appreciated that. At my age, I had learned that quiet facts are usually more frightening than raised voices. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. For one foolish second, I thought it might be my parents calling to say they were coming home early. It was a notification from my mother, but it wasn't a call. She had posted another photo. This one was in Venice. She was smiling beneath a striped awning, a glass of white wine in her hand, with a canal shimmering in the background. My father stood beside her in sunglasses, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in years. The caption read, "taking time to breathe." Everyone needs that sometimes. I stared at the screen until it went dark. Then I drove home. When I opened the front door, Lily was asleep in the recliner, her face turned toward the window. The afternoon sun made her look younger than 30, almost like the little girl who used to wait for me on the porch steps after school. Her hair had thinned, and her cheeks were hollowed out, but in sleep, a trace of her old softness returned. I set my keys down quietly and watched her breathe. The machine beside her clicked softly, monitoring her oxygen. The coffee table was a graveyard of pill bottles, appointment cards, and a legal pad where I tracked everything: blood pressure, fluid intake, headaches, nausea, insurance calls. I had turned our parents' living room into a high-care ward. Not to make a point, but because there was no other choice. Lily woke when the floor creaked under my boot. "You're back," she said, pushing herself up slowly. "Yeah. How did it go?" I hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Her eyes narrowed. That look usually means I'm not going to like the answer. It means I'm thinking. Same thing when it comes to you. I almost smiled. I took the chair across from her and leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. They ran more tests. And I'm a match. Lily went perfectly still. For a heartbeat, she didn't seem to process the words. Then I watched them land. "No," she said immediately. "Lily. No." Her voice wasn't loud, which made it harder to argue with. "You're not doing that. I've already agreed to the next round of evaluations." She shook her head, her eyes beginning to shimmer with unshed tears. "That's not your decision to make by yourself. It's my kidney." "That isn't what I mean." I looked down at my hands. "I know." She pulled her blanket tighter, as if a sudden draft had chilled the room. "You just got back," she said. "You have your career, your health, your whole life ahead of you. And so do you." "No," she whispered, so softly I almost missed it. "Not like you." It was the first time she had voiced her fear out loud. No statistics, no doctor speak, no cheerful lies. Just the raw truth. I moved to the couch and sat beside her. "Look at me," I said. She did. "We are not going to talk like you're already gone." She tried to laugh, but it broke in her throat. "You can't save everybody." "No," I said. "But I can help you. And I will." She lowered her eyes. "What if something happens to you?" "It won't." "You don't know that." She was right. I knew risk better than most. Every career decision I'd made since I was 18 had come with a version of it. But I wasn't being reckless, I was being clear-eyed. "I know enough," I said. "And I know this. I'm not going to sit here and watch you fade away while I wait for Mom and Dad to finish eating pasta in Italy." Lily flinched. Not because of my tone, but because I had finally said what we both had been desperate to ignore. She swallowed hard. Maybe they just couldn't handle it." I turned to her. "Is that really what you think?" She didn't answer. That was answer enough. The truth was, I had spent half my life making excuses for our parents. So had Lily. Dad works hard. Mom is overwhelmed. Stress does strange things to people. Nobody's perfect. Those lies were useful because they contained a grain of truth. But there comes a point where age strips away the luxury of soft language. You stop saying people were confused when they were actually selfish. You stop saying they were tired when they were simply absent. You stop saying they meant well when their actions caused harm. Lily looked at the framed family photo on the bookshelf, a church picnic from years ago. We looked like the kind of family people trusted. "Do you think they'll come back if I get worse?" she asked. The question was so fragile it nearly undid me. I kept my voice steady. "They're coming back soon anyway." That's not what I asked. I leaned back and stared at the wall. No, I thought. I don't. Not in the way that matters. But I couldn't say that to her. She was already carrying too much. "I'm here," I said instead. She gave a small nod, the kind people give when they hear the answer behind the answer. That evening, I made her broth and toast, though she only managed a few bites. Afterward, I spent 2 hours on the phone with the insurance company, being transferred through 6 different departments. By the end, they had denied coverage for a medication her specialist had marked as urgent. I wrote down the appeal instructions, thanked the woman, even though neither of us meant it, and hung up. Then I opened the mail. Utility bills. Hospital statements. Lab invoices. The numbers started to blur. I walked out to the garage and stood by my truck in the dim light. I looked at my second vehicle, an older SUV I'd kept because it was reliable and paid off. The next morning, I sold it. The buyer asked if I was sure. I told him I was. He handed me a cashier's check, and I watched him drive away in a car I had planned to keep for another decade. That money paid for medications, home equipment, and a chunk of Lily's outstanding medical balance. It also bought me something more valuable than pride: time. That night, after dialysis, Lily was so spent she could barely lift her head. I helped her into bed and adjusted her covers. As I reached for the lamp, she whispered my name. "You shouldn't have to do all this." I thought about my parents under the European sun, their easy smiles and vacation captions. Then I looked at my sister. "Maybe not," I said. "But I'm the one who's here." She closed her eyes, and I stayed in the hallway for a long time after the room went silent. Being the one who stays does something to you. It doesn't make you noble or stronger than anyone else. It just strips away the luxury of pretending you don't know what needs to be done. 3 mornings later, the transplant coordinator called while I was folding towels. "We'd like to move you into the next phase," she said. "Cardiac clearance, imaging, blood work. If everything holds, we can start talking about dates." I looked through the doorway at Lily, asleep in the rented hospital bed. That bed was what my parents saw the moment they walked in. It was the first thing that made my mother lose her breath. When she first left, I hadn't known it would come to this. But when Lily started struggling to get from the chair to the bathroom, I knew the house had to change. The delivery men had been quiet and efficient. They moved my father's chair, set up the bed by the window, and plugged in the oxygen unit. They left me standing there with a clipboard and a receipt. I had realized then that a family can shift its entire shape without a single dramatic moment. It happens through paperwork, rented equipment, and meals gone cold because someone is too tired to eat. "I can come in this afternoon," I told the coordinator. "That works," she said. "And Lieutenant, you should know the surgeons will be very blunt with you. This isn't a minor decision." "I know." When I hung up, I stood listening to the hum of the dryer and the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine. Lily woke and called for me. When I got to her, she was trying to sit up without looking winded. "You okay?" I asked. "Just thirsty." I handed her a cup. "You've got your serious face on." That doesn't narrow it down much. It does when you're trying to pretend everything is fine. I sat on the edge of her bed. "Hospital called. More testing." She let that hang in the air. "For the transplant?" "Yes." She looked out the window. Outside, life was moving on schedule. A neighbor was walking a dog. A lawnmower hummed in the distance. "You really aren't waiting for them, are you?" she asked. "No." She turned back to me. "Have you even told them?" I didn't answer quickly enough. "That means no," she said. "I haven't told them yet." "You should." "Why?" Her face tightened. "Because they're still our parents." I looked at her for a long time. There it was, that reflex we had both grown up with. The need to preserve their place in the story, even after they had walked off the stage. "They know you're getting worse," I said. "They know I'm here alone. They know the bills are piling up. They know what dialysis means. That isn't the same as not knowing. They chose not to know the rest." "If you tell them after it's done," Lily whispered, "it will feel like a punishment." That word stuck in my throat. Asterisk punishment. I didn't want to punish them. Punishment was loud and emotional. What I wanted was harder to define. I wanted the truth laid out so clearly it couldn't be stepped around. I wanted a reckoning that didn't involve shouting, because shouting gives selfish people a place to hide. They can blame out-of-control emotions or misunderstandings. No. I wanted them to face facts so cold and orderly that there would be no room left for excuses. That afternoon, I took Lily to dialysis, waited through the 4-hour session, and then drove straight to the hospital for my own appointments. The surgical consult was on the 4th floor. The surgeon was an older man with silver hair and a face that looked like it told the truth for a living. He reviewed my chart, then looked at me over his glasses. "You understand this could affect your future military service?" "Yes." "You understand recovery can be complicated, even when the surgery is a success?" "Yes." "And you understand," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "that donors sometimes minimize what they're giving because they're so focused on the person they love?" I sat perfectly still. "With respect, doctor, I'm not minimizing anything." He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Good. Because I'm not here to talk you out of it. I'm here to make sure you know exactly what it costs." There was a strange comfort in that. Not because the cost was small, but because he didn't insult me by pretending it didn't exist. He walked me through the incisions, the pain management, the limitations, and the risks. He laid it all out. And I listened, ready to pay whatever the price was. He set the folder down and folded his hands, his gaze shifting from the medical charts to my face. "Do you have a support system at home?" I almost laughed. "Not the kind you're thinking of." He must have seen something in my expression, a flicker of weariness or perhaps a hard-edged independence, because he didn't press further. He simply scribbled a note in the file and closed it. When I finally stepped out of the hospital, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement. My phone buzzed just as I reached the parking garage. This time, it was my mother. I stood there for a moment, watching her name flash on the screen, a digital intrusion into the heavy silence. Then I answered. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. Her voice carried a brightness that felt almost aggressive, a sharp contrast to my internal state. In the background, I could hear the vibrant clatter of a restaurant, glassware clinking, the murmur of distant voices, and the swell of Italian music. "Hi, Mom. We just finished dinner. Florence is absolutely beautiful, honey. You would love it here." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until she finally seemed to notice the void on the other end of the line. "How's Lily?" she asked, her tone shifting slightly. "Tired." "Oh, well. Tell her we miss her." "Miss her?" I shut my eyes for a moment, the cold air of the garage biting at my skin. "She's not a summer house, Mom," I said, my voice low and steady. "You don't miss her. You left her." There was a pause, and then my mother's voice dropped an octave, the cheerfulness replaced by a defensive chill. "That's not fair." "No, it isn't. We needed some time," she insisted. "Your father and I were falling apart. The stress was. It was breaking us. And leaving your daughters to deal with it fixed that?" I heard her inhale sharply, a wounded sound. "Why are you being like this?" "Because someone had to be." I wanted to say more, to scream it, but instead, I kept my voice flat. "I'm taking Lily to her appointments. I'm handling the bills. I'm managing the house. I'm handling everything." "We appreciate that," she said quickly, her relief palpable. That almost made me laugh. "Do you?" "Yes, of course. Enough to come home soon." Silence again. In the background, I heard a waiter speaking Italian to a nearby table. My mother lowered her voice, as if trying to manufacture a moment of intimacy across thousands of miles. "We're already halfway through the trip, honey." I looked out across the garage at the evening sky, which was turning a deep, ink black over the city. There it was. The truth, stripped of its finery, not even particularly well disguised. Already halfway through. She didn't ask if Lily was getting worse. She didn't ask what the doctors had said or if I was holding up. She was focused on the itinerary, the schedule, and the inconvenience of a tragedy that didn't fit into her vacation. "I'm a donor match," I said. The line went dead silent. "What?" "For Lily. It's happening." My mother didn't speak for a full 3 seconds. When she finally did, she said exactly what I knew she would. "Don't do anything drastic. We'll talk about this when we get back." I stared at the oil-stained concrete floor of the garage. "When you get back." "Yes, please. Just wait." That word, wait, settled something inside me. It was the final click of a lock. Wait while Lily faded? Wait while they finish their dessert? Wait while they return to their lives slowly, comfortably, and entirely on their own terms? No, I said. I heard her breath catch. What do you mean no? I mean I'm done waiting. Before she could offer another excuse, I ended the call. I stood in that parking garage for a long time, the phone still clutched in my hand. I felt a strange sensation, not rage, but a cold, clarifying stillness. It was the kind of calm that comes after a tactical decision has been made and there is no turning back. When I got home, Lily was awake. She was propped up in the living room bed, the lamp dimmed to a low, amber glow. She looked at my face and knew instantly. You told her. I did. And? I took off my jacket and draped it over a chair, my movements deliberate. And she told me not to do anything drastic. Lily closed her eyes, a small, sad smile touching her lips. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I'm sorry, she whispered. I walked over and adjusted the blanket around her thin shoulders. This isn't yours to be sorry for, Lily. The next morning, I drove back to the hospital and signed the final consent forms to proceed. I wasn't acting out of fearlessness. I was acting because some decisions become undeniably clear the longer other people avoid making their own. The surgery was scheduled for Tuesday. The instructions were clinical and precise. Arrive before dawn. No food after midnight. Clear liquids only. Bring a list of medications. Arrange for someone to drive you home. I nodded through the briefing like I was being prepared for a military operation. Only this time, I told myself I wasn't stepping into the breach alone. The night before the procedure, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I wrote everything down: passwords, account numbers, insurance contacts, the name of Lily's nephrologist, and her complex medication schedule. I did it in case something went wrong, in case someone else had to step in and fill the void I might leave behind. I even wrote down the name and number of our neighbor, Mrs. Donahue, in case Lily needed immediate help while I was still in recovery. I wrote like I was preparing for an extended absence. It wasn't that I expected the worst, but years in uniform had taught me one thing: hoping things go right is not the same as planning for when they don't. Around 10 p.m., Lily shuffled into the kitchen, wrapped in a thick blanket. You're still up, she said. So are you. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down slowly, her movements pained. What are you writing? Just making sure things are covered. Her eyes tracked across the pad, taking in the dense columns of information. That's a lot of just. I set the pen down. It's nothing you need to worry about. That's not how this works anymore, she said gently, her voice cracking. We don't get to decide what the other one worries about. She was right. We hadn't been living that way for weeks. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of the coming hours. Surgery's at 6 a.m., I said. She nodded once, a sharp, singular motion, as if she had been bracing for the confirmation. And you didn't tell them again, did you? No, not even after the call? No. She exhaled slowly, her breath hitching. I keep thinking maybe they'll show up at the last minute. Like in those movies where someone runs through the airport because they finally realize what matters. I almost smiled. This isn't a movie, Lily. I know. She looked down at her hands, which were pale and trembling. I don't want you to go through this without them knowing. I'm not going through it without someone knowing, I said, catching her gaze. I know. And you know. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. I wish it was me, she whispered. I wish I was the one giving. I shook my head. I don't. At 4:30 a.m., the house was a tomb of silence. I moved with quiet efficiency, turning on only the lights I absolutely needed. The routine felt eerily familiar, like the early deployments of my past, the quiet departures before the rest of the world woke up. I paused in the doorway of the living room. Lily was asleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest steady beneath the blankets. The oxygen machine hummed beside her, a constant, low-frequency note that had become the soundtrack of our lives. I stood there longer than I intended, just watching her. Then I walked over and adjusted the blanket one last time. Hey, she said suddenly, her voice rough with sleep. I froze. You're supposed to be asleep. So are you. I crouched beside the bed, my heart thumping against my ribs. You ready? She asked. As I'll ever be. She reached out, her small hand finding mine and squeezing with surprising strength. You come back, she said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. I will. You promise? I met her eyes in the dim light. I promise. She held on for a second longer, then let go. Go, she said softly. Before I change my mind and chain you to the radiator. Mrs. Donahue was waiting on the porch in her robe when I stepped outside into the pre-dawn chill. I'll sit with her, she said, her voice steady and kind. Don't you worry about a thing. Thank you, Martha. She waved me off, dismissing my gratitude. Go on now. Get moving. I drove to the hospital in the dark. The streets were nearly empty, the city still dreaming. When I pulled into the lot, the sky was just beginning to bleed into a pale gray. Inside, everything moved with clinical, quiet efficiency. There was paperwork, vitals, and a nurse with kind eyes who explained every step, even though I already knew the procedure by heart. They gave me a thin hospital gown and a plastic ID bracelet. Any last questions? The nurse asked. I thought about it for a second. No. She smiled gently. That's usually the sign of someone who's already made up their mind. I lay back on the narrow gurney as they wheeled me toward the operating room. The fluorescent ceiling lights passed overhead like rhythmic pulses. For a moment, I let my eyes close, not out of fear, but to find that pocket of stillness I needed. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the heavy, burdened silence of our house, but something different, controlled, measured, and sterile. The second thing I noticed was the pain. It wasn't sharp at first. It was a deep, crushing pressure that radiated from my side, a physical reminder that something essential had been taken from me and given to another. A nurse leaned over me, her face a blur of blue scrubs. You're in recovery, she said. The surgery went very well. I managed a slight nod. Lily? Your sister is stable, she added, sensing my unspoken question. She's in the ICU for observation, but everything looks good. That was the only part that mattered. The next few days were a blur of white sheets and regulated discomfort. Pain medication, short, grueling walks down the hallway to prevent blood clots, and a constant stream of doctors checking incisions. I learned how to move with caution, how to sit up without pulling at the stitches, how to breathe through the ache instead of fighting it. Lily was in a different wing, but they finally allowed me to see her once I was stable enough to be wheeled over. She looked pale, smaller than I had ever seen her, but she was awake. Hey, she croaked when she saw me. Hey yourself. My voice wasn't much better. You did it, she said, a faint light in her eyes. So did you. She smiled weakly. You always did like being the overachiever. I almost laughed, but the movement sent a sharp jolt through my side, reminding me of the cost. We didn't talk long. We didn't need to. There was an understanding between us now that transcended words, a literal, biological bond that couldn't be broken. On the third day, I asked for my phone. The nurse hesitated, but eventually handed it over. Just for a few minutes, she cautioned. There were messages from my old unit and a few from distant relatives. There was nothing from my parents. I wasn't surprised, but the void where their concern should have been still felt cold. I scrolled past the notifications and opened a folder on my phone where I had been saving digital documents. Hospital bills. Receipts. Insurance denials. A log of every call I had made and every expense I had covered. It was a meticulous record of everything that had happened while they were away. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't even about revenge, at least not in the traditional sense. It was about creating a record, something permanent and undeniable. When I was finally discharged, Mrs. Donahue drove me home. You just rest, she said, helping me out of the car and toward the front door. I'll keep an eye on your sister until you're back on your feet. I appreciate it, Martha. More than I can say. She smiled, patting my arm. Of course you do. You were raised right. I didn't have the heart to tell her that I had raised myself. Inside, the house felt different. It wasn't empty, and it didn't feel heavy anymore. It just felt changed. The hospital bed was still by the window, and the stacks of paperwork were still on the kitchen table. But there was a new sense of quiet certainty. I lowered myself carefully into my chair and looked around the room. I thought about everything that had happened, everything that had been done, and more importantly, everything that had been missed by the people who were supposed to be here. While my parents had been strolling through ancient cities and taking photos under foreign lights, life here hadn't paused. It had surged forward. It had required sacrifice. And it had moved on without them. The first morning back, I woke up before my alarm. Habit. For a split second, I forgot where I was, but then the ache in my side flared up, a steady, pulsing reminder to move with respect for what had been done. I sat up slowly, waited for the room to stop spinning, and then stood. The house was quiet, but it was an intentional quiet. Lily was already awake when I reached the living room. She had propped herself up against the pillows, a book open in her lap, though she clearly wasn't reading. "You're up," she said. "So are you." She gave me a small, genuine smile. "I actually slept." "That's good, Lily. That's more than good." It was the first time in weeks she hadn't qualified that statement with a little, or not much. I checked her vitals and the medication schedule I had taped to the side table. Everything was steady. For the first time in a long while, there wasn't an immediate crisis to manage. Recovery isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with a fanfare. It shows up in the smallest details: Lily asking for toast instead of just water, her walking from the bed to the kitchen without having to stop for air, her sitting up a little longer each afternoon. One evening, she actually laughed at something on the television, a real, full-bellied sound. Each of those moments felt like a victory. By the end of the week, I could move through the house without bracing myself against the walls. I moved slowly, deliberately, at a pace that forced me to notice things I usually ignored: the way the sunlight hit the floorboards, the specific creak of the hallway, and the stack of unopened mail sitting on the side table. I brought the mail to the kitchen and started sorting. Bills. More bills. Lab statements. And then, something else. A notice from the mortgage company marked in red. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain. That afternoon, I called the number on the letter. The man who answered sounded weary, the voice of someone who had held this exact conversation too many times. "Yes, ma'am," he said after I gave him the account number. "There are significant outstanding balances. Several missed payments." "Missed by whom?" I asked. There was a brief pause as he consulted the file. "By the account holders. Your parents." I looked toward the living room, at the hospital bed and my sister sitting quietly with a blanket over her shoulders. "They told me everything was current," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I can only tell you what's on the screen, ma'am." "How long has it been like this?" 3 months. 3 months. This had started before they left. Before the stress became too much. Before they decided they needed space. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat there for a long time, not shocked, not even angry. Just clear. That night, I went through every drawer and every file in the house. I found bank statements, loan records, and insurance papers. What I found wasn't chaos, it was worse. It was quiet, calculated neglect. Late payments, deferred notices, and minimum balances met just barely enough to avoid immediate foreclosure. They hadn't intended to solve the problem. They had simply run away from it. The next morning, I called a lawyer. His office was downtown, in a building that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. He listened without interrupting as I laid it all out: the trip, the medical crisis, the surgery, and the financial abandonment. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair. "And your goal?" he asked. "I don't want to lose this house," I said. "And I don't want Lily to ever be at the mercy of their needs again." He nodded slowly. "Are you prepared to take on the financial responsibility legally?" "I already have been." "That's not the same as legal standing." He studied me for a moment. "Are you ready to make this permanent?" "I am." He opened a folder and began to take notes. "There are options, but they require documentation. Proof of payment. Proof of care. Proof that you have been the sole responsible party while they were absent." "I have all of it. Every receipt. Every log." "I thought you might," he said with a grim smile. Over the next few days, I gathered the remaining evidence. I organized it by date, by amount, and by necessity. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it with the precision of a soldier. Clarity wins where emotion fails. Lily watched me one evening as I categorized a fresh stack of hospital invoices. "You're building a case," she observed. "I'm building a record of the truth." She was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds like something that's going to hurt when they get back." "It probably will." "And you're okay with that?" I set the folder down and looked her in the eye. "I'm okay with them finally seeing exactly what they chose to ignore." A message came in from my mother that night. It was a photo of a sunset over a vineyard, captioned, "Can't wait to come home and relax after this long trip." Relax. I stared at the word until it lost all meaning. Then I turned the phone face down on the table. 2 days later, another message arrived. We land tomorrow. No questions about Lily's health. No acknowledgement of the silence. Just a statement of their arrival, as if they were returning from a routine errand. The morning they were due back, I helped Lily sit up a little straighter in her bed. "They're coming home today," I said. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been gone for a long time," she said. Even though I never left the living room. I understood that perfectly. By the afternoon, the house was ready. I didn't stage it, I just made it honest. Every overdue bill was in its place. Every medical record was visible. Every consequence of their absence was waiting quietly for them to find it. When I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway, I didn't get up. Some moments don't require preparation. They just require the truth. I heard the car doors slam. Then, the distinct scrape of suitcase wheels against the pavement. I heard my mother's voice, a quick, muffled murmur, followed by my father's heavier footfalls on the porch. Inside, the oxygen machine continued its steady, rhythmic hum. Lily sat propped up in the hospital bed, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles were white. She had considered going to her bedroom before they arrived, but at the last moment, she had changed her mind. "No," she had said. "If they're going to see it, they should see it all." The front door opened. My mother stepped in first, clutching a designer handbag and wearing that particular travel smile, the one people bring home from vacation when they expect to be welcomed back into the lives they paused. My father followed her, hauling 2 large suitcases, his face set in the stiff, weary expression of a man who is already annoyed by the flight. Then, they looked up. The change was instantaneous. My mother's suitcase slipped from her hand, tipping over with a heavy thud. One wheel spun uselessly in the air for a few seconds before coming to a stop. My father froze, his hand still gripped around the handle of his bag, his shoulders locking into place. The room was not the one they had left. My father's favorite recliner was gone. In its place stood the rented hospital bed, its metal rails half-raised. The portable oxygen unit stood like a silent sentry beside it. Trays of medication lined the side table. A medical chart hung from a clipboard. And on the coffee table, laid out like a deck of cards, were the bottles, the receipts, the appointment summaries, and the organized folders. And there was Lily, thin, pale, but very much alive, sitting in the center of the wreckage. My mother's eyes darted around the room, settling on Lily, then on me. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, this can't be happening." My father set his suitcase down slowly, as if a sudden movement might make the scene real. "What is all this?" he asked. His voice was gruff, but I could hear the tremor of shock underneath. Neither Lily nor I answered him immediately. My mother took a tentative step toward the bed. "Lily, honey." Lily looked at her. There was no cruelty in her gaze, but there was no warmth either. Just a profound, hollow exhaustion. "You came back," she said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them made my mother flinch. My father's gaze swung to the oxygen unit, then to the folders on the table. "Why is there a hospital bed in my living room?" That was the first thing he chose to say. Not a question about her health. Not an apology. Just a claim of ownership. My living room. I looked at him for a long, cold moment. Because she couldn't make it to her bedroom anymore. He stared at me, his face reddening. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth. "What do you mean?" I said evenly, that while you were in Europe, Lily got worse. Much worse. My mother shook her head frantically. No, you said she was just tired." "You never said." I said enough. My voice was calm, which seemed to unsettle them more than if I had been screaming. My father frowned, trying to regain some sense of authority. Why didn't you tell us it had gotten this bad? We would have. He trailed off, unable to finish the lie. I reached out and picked up the top folder from the coffee table. I did tell you, I said. You just didn't want to ask the questions that would require you to come home. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of clipped papers. This is her dialysis record for the month you were gone, I said, placing it on the table in front of them. These are the medication changes. These are the insurance denials. These are the invoices for the home medical equipment. I set down a second, thicker stack. And these are the missed mortgage notices that started arriving 3 months ago, well before you ever boarded that plane. My father's expression shifted. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but a sharp, defensive recognition. He knew exactly what I had found. My mother looked from one pile to the other, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged. I don't understand, she whimpered. You understood enough to leave, I said. My father's jaw set. Watch your tone with us. I looked him dead in the eye. I saw the old reflex in him, the need to pivot the conversation, to make this about respect and attitude rather than the truth of his own failures. No, I said, my voice cutting through his defense like a blade. Not today. The room went deathly still. Even Lily lifted her head a little higher at that. My mother sank slowly onto the edge of the sofa, her legs seemingly unable to support her. We just needed some time, she whispered weakly. Your father and I were exhausted. Everything in this house had become so heavy. We were drowning. I nodded once. Yes, I said. It was heavy. It still is. She looked at me with wet, bewildered eyes, as if I had somehow failed to be sympathetic to the burden of her absence. My father stepped toward the table and reached for one of the notices, his hand shaking. These payments were late for 3 months, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. You were hiding this long before you left. He dropped the paper back onto the stack, as if it had burned him. I was handling it. No, I said. You were avoiding it. And then you walked away and left us to deal with the collapse. His face flushed a deep, angry red. You don't know everything that goes on in this family. I almost smiled, but there was no humor in my heart. I know exactly what goes on now, Dad. I've seen the receipts. You're right, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. I only know what I paid. I only know the weight of the papers I had to sign alone. And I know exactly what she went through while you were sipping wine in Italy. My mother flinched as if I'd struck her. My father took another menacing step toward me, his shadow falling over my chair. That's enough. No, Lily said quietly. All 3 of us turned toward her. She was sitting a little straighter now, her pale hand pressed lightly against the hospital blanket draped over her lap. That's enough, she repeated, looking directly at our father. For once in your life, just let her finish. I hadn't heard that tone from Lily in years, maybe ever. It was a cold, hard authority that seemed to knock the wind right out of him. He stopped dead in his tracks. I reached for the last folder on the table. This one was thinner, more clinical, and felt much more final. I was a donor match, I said. My mother blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. What? For Lily. I was her match. Neither of them spoke. The silence in the room became suffocating. I found out while you were gone, I continued. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. When my father finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a low, hollow vibration. What are you saying? I held his gaze, refusing to look away. I'm saying the surgery happened 2 weeks ago. My mother let out a small, broken sound, a stifled sob, and looked at Lily as if searching her face for a lie. Lily didn't give her one. She just stared back, her silence a heavy confirmation. Then my mother looked at me. Really looked at me. Her eyes dropped to the way I was sitting, careful, stiff, one side of my body instinctively guarded and protected. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No. I set the folder on the table in front of them. Inside were the surgical records, the discharge summaries, and the long list of follow-up instructions. I gave her my kidney, I said clearly, while you were gone. My mother pressed both hands over her mouth. My father had gone completely pale, the angry red drained from his face. For a long moment, Neither of them seemed able to bridge the gap between the room they were standing in and the vacation they had just lived through. It was all there, laid bare on the table. The bed, the machines, the mounting bills, the legal notices, the physical cost. It wasn't an exaggeration. It wasn't a play for sympathy. It was documented. It was real. And then my mother said the words I had heard in my mind long before they ever left her lips. No. No, this can't be happening. But it had happened. That was the immovable truth. It had happened slowly and painfully, one ordinary, grueling day at a time, while they were thousands of miles away pretending that life had simply asked too much of them. My father sank into the chair by the window as if the bones in his legs had turned to lead. My mother was crying now, but softly, the kind of quiet weeping that comes from pure shock. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to accuse them anymore. The truth was sitting in the room with us, breathing, recovering, and looking right back at them. Nobody said anything for a long time. The oxygen machine kept humming its steady, rhythmic pulse. A car passed by outside. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then went quiet. It struck me then how ordinary the afternoon sounded, even with my mother collapsed in tears on the couch and my father looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. That is one of the strangest things about the worst moments in life. The world doesn't stop to honor them. It just keeps moving. My father was the first to break the silence. His voice was rough, like gravel. You should have called again. I looked at him, and for one brief second, I felt a hysterical urge to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. There it was, that last, thin instinct to reach for a version of the story where he was less responsible. He wasn't claiming innocence, he knew better than that now, but he wanted to be less to blame. It was the kind of sentence people use when the truth is too massive to look at directly. Asterisk, you should have explained it differently. You should have made me understand. I leaned one hand against the table, mindful of the ache in my side. No, I said quietly. You should have come home. He looked at me, and something in his face finally gave way. It wasn't just his pride breaking, it was something deeper. My mother lowered her hands, though her fingers were still trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Lily first. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. Oh, honey. Lily didn't answer. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She simply had nothing left to give them that hadn't been earned. My mother turned to me, her eyes red-rimmed. Why didn't you tell us after the surgery? I thought about that. There are questions people ask because they want information, and there are questions they ask because they're looking for a bridge back into a room they no longer know how to enter. Because by then, it wasn't information you needed, I said honestly. It was consequences. The words landed hard. My mother closed her eyes. My father stared at the papers again, perhaps hoping to find a version of them that hurt less. There wasn't one. After another long silence, Lily spoke. I really thought you'd come home, she said. She didn't say it loudly, and she didn't say it to wound them. That was what made it unbearable. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before, not a normal cry of frustration or grief, but something closer to pure shame. We were wrong, she choked out, her voice shaking. We were so wrong. My father stayed still for a few more seconds. Then he stood up, not all at once, but slowly, as if it took a physical effort just to exist inside his own body. He looked at Lily, then at me. And finally, he said the words I had waited my whole life to hear, even though I'd stopped expecting them years ago. I failed both of you. The room went quiet in a new way after that. I watched his face carefully, looking for the old signs of defensiveness or the need to explain himself. They were there at first, flickering around the edges, but they didn't take hold. He looked at the missed mortgage notices, the hospital invoices, and the surgical records. Then he looked at the rented hospital bed in the middle of his living room. No, he said again, more to himself this time. I failed you both. My mother moved from the couch to the side of Lily's bed and sank carefully into the chair beside it. Can I sit here? She asked. Lily gave a small, hesitant nod. My mother reached for her hand, but stopped just short, waiting for permission. After a moment, Lily let her take it. That was the first grace offered in that room. Small, fragile, but real. My father turned toward me. What do I do now? For a second, I saw the younger version of him in that question, the man who always wanted a practical task, a step-by-step guide to fixing things with effort rather than feeling. In another season of my life, that would have irritated me. But age teaches you something about remorse. When it's real, it doesn't always come dressed in perfect words. Sometimes it shows up clumsy, late, and humiliated, simply asking what's left to do. So I answered him plainly. You pay what you owe. You stop pretending things fix themselves. You show up not just for an afternoon, and not just when it's convenient. You stay. He nodded once, then again. I will. I believed he meant it. That didn't mean I trusted him yet. Those are two very different things, but it was a start. Over the next week, I watched the shift happen. My father canceled every travel arrangement they had planned for the rest of the summer. I heard him on the phone in the den, his voice flat and resolute. No, we won't be rescheduling. He met with the mortgage company. He sold off an investment account he had been hoarding for years and used the money to clear the back balance and bring the house current. He called the billing offices I had been fighting with, and for the first time in his life, he let the hold music punish him instead of leaving the burden to someone else. My mother changed in quieter ways. She learned Lily's medication schedule by heart. She kept a notebook of blood pressure readings in careful, precise handwriting. She sat through follow-up appointments and took notes without flinching at the difficult news. Twice, I caught her standing in the hallway outside Lily's room late at night, one hand over her mouth, just listening to make sure my sister's breathing stayed steady. She started cooking again, too, simple things at first. Soup, toast, soft eggs, the kind of food you make when you are trying to care for someone, not impress them. None of it erased what they had done. That is another lesson age teaches you. Real repentance does not erase the wound. It accepts that the wound is there and chooses to work through it anyway. My own recovery moved forward slowly. The sharp pain in my side ebbed into a dull ache, and the stiffness began to fade. By the third week, I could walk around the block without feeling that deep, tugging pull. Lily got stronger, too. Color returned to her cheeks. She started eating more. One afternoon, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a crossword puzzle. For a second, the sight of something so ordinary nearly brought me to tears. I stood in the doorway and watched her. What? She asked, smiling slightly. Nothing, I said. You're just doing a crossword. Well, she said, I thought I'd start with something ambitious. That made me laugh, a small laugh, but a real one. My mother looked up from the sink when she heard it. She didn't say a word. She just closed her eyes for a brief second, as if the sound of laughter in the house was almost more than she could bear. One Sunday afternoon, about a month after my parents came home, we all sat on the back porch together. Not because everything was solved, but because the weather was good. Lily wanted the sunlight, and no one felt like arguing. My father sat across from me, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. He looked older than he had before the Europe trip, not weaker, just more honest. I keep thinking about that sentence you said, he whispered. Which one? He swallowed hard. I'm the one here. I hadn't realized Lily had told him that. He nodded toward the house. She said that's what you told her over and over again. I looked out over the yard. The grass was getting long, and the fence would need staining before the first frost. Mrs. Donnelly's beagle was barking at squirrels on the other side of the hedge. Normal things. I said. My father nodded, his eyes lowered. I should have been. That was the closest thing to an explanation he ever offered, and maybe it was enough. Not because it balanced the scales, nothing ever could, but because it was the truth without any decoration. Lily leaned her head back against the porch chair and closed her eyes in the warm sun. We're here now, my mother said softly. I looked at her. Her face held no defenses anymore, just a mix of hope, fear, and the quiet knowledge that both belonged there. Yes, I said. You are. And that was where the reconciliation actually began. It didn't start with forgiveness spoken too quickly, or a single dramatic apology, or tears alone. It began with the act of staying, with paying attention, with learning late in life that love is not proven by how you feel when things are easy, it is proven by where you stand when things are hard. That is the lesson I took from all of this. It's not that families never fail, they do. Sometimes they fail in ways that cut so deep you wonder if anything honest can ever grow back in that soil. But it can. It can grow if the truth is faced, if pride is laid down, and if people are finally willing to remain in the very places they once ran away from. So, if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you need to call, someone to forgive, someone to thank, or someone to simply sit beside, don't wait for the perfect moment. The older I get, the more I believe that the people who love us best are not always the ones who speak the most beautifully. They are the ones who stay when staying costs them something. If that means something to you, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And stay with us for the next one.